Hi, guys. Today, we will start with the story How People Treated Insomnia. 500 years ago. In the late 15th century, night fell quickly. The sun sank behind the hills, and villages were swallowed by a thick, quiet darkness. Without electricity, the blackness became dense and almost tangible. Village homes glowed faintly behind wooden shutters, lit only by slivers of tallow candles, oil lamps, or the low coals in stone hearths. In a peasant house on the edge of Bavaria, as in many others, the day ended well before midnight. People went to bed soon after supper. The fire faded, the air thickened with the scent of smoke and boiled turnips, and the wind began to howl beyond the walls. But not everyone could sleep easily. Even then, there were nights when the body was tired, but the mind wandered restlessly. A woman named Gretel, who lived with her 3 children and aging mother, knew this all too well. For the second winter in a row, she often lay awake, eyes open, listening to the old wooden frame creak in the cold wind. 5 centuries ago, insomnia was not seen as a medical condition. It had many names: night restlessness, devil's wakefulness, disturbed humors. People blamed spirits, stale air, certain foods, or even the moon's position. Remedies were many, and most felt more magical than medicinal. Back then, sleeplessness was seen as either punishment or a warning. Those who lay awake avoided making noise. Too much in the dark world seemed alive, especially when thoughts refused to settle. So began another of many nights in which Gretel, like thousands before her, sought rest that would not come. And ahead lay 21 ways she, and others like her, would try to summon sleep. The first remedies: warmth and ritual. As the wind coiled around the wooden corners of the house, Gretel rose slowly from her straw mattress, careful not to wake the children sleeping nearby. The air inside was cold enough to turn her breath to mist. Her joints creaked as she moved, a reminder of both age and labor. She reached for a small woolen shawl that hung from a peg near the hearth, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders. The first and most natural remedy for sleeplessness in those days was warmth. It was believed that a warm body invited sleep, while a cold one was vulnerable to wandering thoughts and nighttime spirits. Across Europe, this belief was nearly universal. Peasants would heat bricks or stones near the fire and wrap them in cloth before placing them in the bed. Sometimes sacks of warm grain or sand were used in the same way. Gretel approached the hearth, where the last embers of the fire glowed beneath a covering of ash. With practiced hands, she uncovered a still glowing piece of charcoal and nudged it with a stick. A soft orange light bloomed. She placed 2 smooth river stones beside the ember, hoping they would capture enough heat to warm her bedding. She did not hurry. Nothing about the night was meant to be rushed. In households where firewood was scarce, heat was precious. It was carefully rationed, saved for cooking and the brief hours before sleep. But for those battling wakefulness, a little warmth was worth the sacrifice. While the stones heated, Gretel turned to another ritual: the soothing of the senses. She reached into a small wooden box kept on a high shelf. Inside were dried herbs: chamomile, lavender, valerian root. Not expensive herbs, but lovingly gathered in late summer from the edges of the forest. These herbs were believed to calm the nervous wind in the body, to quiet the heart and draw down the eyelids. She took a pinch of the lavender and placed it in a scrap of linen, tying it with thread and tucking it into her pillow. Its fragrance was faint, but familiar, earthy, floral, a reminder of sunlit meadows long gone beneath winter snow. In towns and monasteries, wealthier sleepers might steep such herbs in hot water to make a tisane. But Gretel, like most villagers, rarely wasted fuel on boiling water at night. Instead, she trusted in the ritual itself, believing that the careful, quiet act of preparing the herbs told her body it was time to rest. Medieval beliefs about sleep were not purely practical. There was symbolism in every action. A warm stone was not just comfort, it was a barrier against the cold spirits of the night. A sachet of lavender was not just a scent, it was a ward, a soft shield of nature between the sleeper and the things that walked unseen in the dark. Sleep, 500 years ago, was not just a biological need. It was a spiritual crossing, a journey through the unknown. And preparing for it required respect, patience, and the repetition of small, sacred actions. So Gretel wrapped the warm stones in cloth, slipped them under her blanket, and lay down again. The bed was no softer than before, the wind no quieter, but something had shifted. A rhythm had begun. The body, sensing heat and scent, was being told it could soften. The mind, lulled by old rituals, was being told it was safe to let go. Sleep did not come yet, but now it was closer. Herbs rooted in time. The warmth from the heated stones beneath the blanket was beginning to seep into the bedding, but Gretel still could not sleep. Her body, weary from the day's labor, seemed willing to surrender, but her mind would not. Thoughts continued to buzz like lazy bees in her head, refusing to quiet down. So, she rose again, slowly, like someone who had already accepted that the night would be long. In those times, dreams and the sleepless hours that preceded them were not seen only as biological. They were mystical. Sleep was believed to be a threshold between worlds, the physical and the spiritual. And insomnia, at times, was thought to be a sign that this threshold had been disturbed. The wise old women would say that in such moments, one must turn to nature, for nature alone knew the proper path into sleep. Gretel opened a heavy, darkened chest that stood against the wall. Inside, among folded towels and scraps of wool, she kept a small pouch filled with dried herbs, gathered by her own hands in the summer months on the hillside. These were no ordinary herbs. They were knowledge, passed from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter. First came valerian root, strong-scented, almost harsh. In the village, it was known as sleep root or heart root. It was said to calm the pulse, slow the breath, and drive away nighttime fear. Gretel disliked its odor, but knew if sleep would not come, it must be honestly invited, given earth in which to grow. Next came lemon balm, soft, warm-scented, like a summer evening after rain. It grew near the fence, close to home. A humble plant, but strong. Old herbals said it tames the spirits of anxiety and returns gentleness to the heart. She also reached for dried rose petals, gathered during the midsummer festival of Saint John, and a handful of hops cones, often tied into small pillows and placed near the head. Hops were considered a potent ally, binding the mind and weaving dreams, as folk wisdom went. Unhurried, Gretel mixed the herbs on a wooden board, grinding them gently with a mortar, inhaling their layered aromas. The house filled with a soft, bitter fragrance, part medicine, part meadow, as if a door had opened to an old monastery garden. But it was not only the blend that mattered, it was the ritual. Every motion, every quiet repetition echoed a memory older than language, older than books. She took a piece of linen, placed the mixture inside, folded it into a small bundle, tied it with wool thread, and laid it beside her pillow. Elsewhere in Europe, monks might steep these same herbs in warm wine or infuse them into honey. Those with more resources prepared ointments, rubbing them on temples or wrists. But peasants had fewer ingredients, though more patience and more faith in the power of small things done with care. It was said that sleep loved silence, warmth, and repetition. If you invited it properly, it would come, not as a guest, but as an old friend who sat quietly at the edge of your bed. Gretel lay down again. The herb sachet was still warm from her hands. The pillow smelled faintly of summer, long buried beneath winter. The stones beneath her feet still held the memory of fire. The children breathed softly in their sleep. The wind still howled beyond the walls, but somehow it sounded farther away now, as if it had drifted to another part of the forest. Sleep had not arrived yet, But now, it was following her trail. The body's prayer and the shadow of sleep. The night had deepened. Even the wind outside seemed to breathe more slowly, as if the world itself had entered a quiet state of waiting. Gretel lay still, feeling the warmth of the stones gradually spread across her legs, sensing how the herbs whispered softly into the darkness. And yet, sleep had not come. Somewhere deep within her body, a faint shiver remained, like the aftertaste of an unresolved thought. At such hours when warmth and fragrance failed, people turned to what remained, the rhythm and silence of the body. 500 years ago, there was no word for meditation in the modern sense. But village women and monks alike understood one thing. If the mind would not be still, one had to speak to the body. Gretel slowly turned to lie on her side, placing her hand under her head. Every movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. She had learned one must not toss and turn with irritation. Sleep was like a small animal that could be frightened away. Each motion was a kind of vow, each breath a silent prayer. In the villages of the time, a simple technique was passed down from lips to ears. Count your breathing, as you would count lambs by the stream. One was not simply to breathe, but to notice the breath, to let the body become slow, like a river under winter ice. She inhaled and silently counted. 1. A long, slow exhale. 2. Each inhale was given a number, each exhale, silence. It was said that if a person reached 50, they were already at the edge of sleep. But even if not, the act itself slowed the blood, drew the thoughts away like a shepherd drawing sheep into shade. There were other bodily rituals. Some wrapped their feet in warm cloth, believing cold feet barred the soul from sleep's door. Others placed their hands over their chest, so the heart would hear the warmth of the palm. This was common among widows who slept alone. A hand could replace the absent embrace of a husband. In monasteries, another method was used, the repetition of phrases. These were not quite prayers, but short, rhythmic sentences, whispered within. Phrases the mind could repeat until only the shape of the sound remained. A common folk saying was, repeat a word until its meaning fades. Then, only silence is left. Gretel recalled a line she once heard from a nun in her youth. Let the shadow of sleep cover me, as the plow covers the seed. A strange phrase, but gentle, earthly. She repeated it in her mind, like a lullaby sung to herself. With each repetition, the word shadow became softer, plow deeper, and seed warmer. The house around her breathed, dull, steady. A plank near the hearth creaked. One of the children shifted in sleep and sighed. Somewhere in a corner, a mouse stirred, then froze. Nothing in this soundscape was frightening. It was part of the night's world, part of what had always been and always would be. They believed the night was alive. It had ears. And if you spoke to it rightly, it would answer. Not in words, but in shelter. Another hour passed. Sleep had not yet come. But now it was drawing closer. It could feel the warmth. It could hear the breath. It already knew the name of the one who waited. The infusion of silence. Gretel still could not sleep. The night seemed to stretch, not by the hour, but by the breath, by the shadows on the ceiling, by the slow creaks of the wooden walls. Somewhere behind the stove, a twig snapped, and the silence became tangible, like steam from the mouth on a winter morning. In her world, there were no clocks, no alarms, no diagnosis of insomnia. There was only night, and sometimes it did not let go. Her body already lay still. The herbs had faded into a soft, lingering scent. The prayers of the mind were silent, and yet within her, there remained a formless unease, like water in a dark barrel. You couldn't see its source, but you could feel its weight. So she turned to the last method she knew from her youth, a warm herbal drink. 5 centuries ago, warm drinks before bed weren't a matter of habit, but of healing. Herbal infusions, decoctions, night drafts. They weren't made for taste, but for peace. The folk used to say, "What has passed through fire knows how to guide the soul." Gretel rose slowly. The stove had nearly gone cold, but deep in the ash there was still warmth. She opened the iron flap, found a glowing ember, placed it into a small iron pot, and balanced a little kettle of water above it. The sound of water heating was quiet, like a sleeping infant's breath. Heat rose into the air, warming her palms, her face, her thoughts. On a shelf stood a clay jar containing her rarest herbs, kept not for food or guests, but for dreams. She took a few leaves of oregano, a pinch of lavender, a couple of linden petals, and the smallest sliver of valerian root, just enough for a whisper. Oregano was a woman's herb, gentle and protective. In old times, it was placed under pillows of brides and new mothers, believed to ward off bad dreams. Lavender, scent of monasteries, travels, and letters never sent. Linden, warmth of childhood. Valerian, heavy, anchoring, pulling downward into silence. She poured boiling water over them and sat by the hearth. In the dark, the herbs seemed to breathe. First, a wave of spice, then bitterness, and at last, a smoky sweetness. The mug warmed her hands. It was said that if warmth lived in your palms, the heart would soften. She drank slowly, not in gulps, but in touches. The old women used to teach, do not drink sleep, invite it. Each sip closed another door. The door to worry, the door to memories, the door to fear. For her children, for the crops, for the winter still to come. Somewhere far off, a dog barked, not from her village. That meant either a traveler or a forest animal. Gretel did not feel fear. At that hour, fear was often just a reflection in the water. Blow on it, and it vanished. When the cup was empty, she noticed her body felt heavier, her fingers faintly numb from the warmth, and her eyelids from the softness of the moment. Sleep had not yet arrived, but it now stood at the threshold. It knew it was awaited. It could taste the herbs, familiar since childhood. It could hear how the house was lulling itself. She returned to her bed, lay down like a tree lying on the earth, calm, without effort, without control. And then, not suddenly, not sharply, the darkness came. True darkness. The kind where there are no thoughts, no worries, no words. Only the slow descent into depth, where sleep is no longer a guest, but a master. The sleep that walks the path dawn had arrived, but it had not yet touched the windows. In those days, light didn't come with a switch. It approached slowly, like a hunter in the fog, stepping softly between tree branches, along rooftops and chimneys. Somewhere in the chicken coop, a rooster gave a restrained cry, but even he wasn't fully convinced the night had gone. Gretel was asleep. Not like a weary person, but like soil that had drunk deeply of the rain, deeply, peacefully, without motion. Sleep had come to her, not by command, not by plea, but like a guest who was never turned away. It had taken its time, through breath, through herbs, through the warmth of stones and the quiet of solitude, and when it finally arrived, it stayed. Back then, people knew sleep wasn't a tool, nor a right, nor an obligation. It was a force that walked a path. It might bypass those who were too loud. It might turn its back on those who demanded, but it always heard those who waited silently. Sleep was not measured in hours. No one tracked phases, counted cycles, wore rings or wristbands. Everything was different, simpler, but also deeper. Sleep was a relationship. If you respected its rhythm, it respected your body. While Gretel slept, the house lived. The logs creaked softly as if sharing dreams with one another. The old rat in the corner froze. It wasn't her time. The time of sleep was a time of stillness, even for mice and wind. When Gretel awoke, the world was already different. The air smelled of ash and dampness. Warm, murky light seeped through the curtain, Something clinked behind the stove. Perhaps the cat, or a spoon on the shelf. She didn't remember her dreams. In that era, dreams weren't written down or analyzed. They were felt in the morning body, in the weight of the head, in the way the eyes met the ground. If the dream had been kind, the grass outside seemed greener. If restless, even the porridge tasted bitter. But today there was no heaviness, not in her limbs, not in her thoughts. That meant the night had been lived properly. The insomnia had come, yes, but it had not won. And that was enough. She rose, put on her shoes, stirred the stove. The children still slept. The world was warm, muted, soft. And in that world, sleep had left a trace. Not in memory, not in words, but in peace. Peace. That was what people sought in those times. Not sleep as a biological need, not rest as a process. They sought the restoration of their bond with silence. The silence from which we rise each morning like from deep water. That's why each evening was a preparation for return. The body was washed, the space cleared, words softened, and the night became not a threat, but a companion. Gretel knew the sleeplessness would return. It never leaves forever. But now she remembered the path. She remembered how to move slowly, how to listen to silence, how not to chase the night away, but to let it in, like an old, stubborn, but needed guest. The fabric in which the night is sewn. The day began without haste. Morning back then was no race, no flurry of alarms, schedules, or urgent tasks. Morning was a return to light, unhurried, like trees awakening in spring. Everything unfolded as it was ready. Not the world for the person, but the person for the world. Gretel brewed her first water of the day. Not strong tea, not coffee, but just hot water with dried rose hips, as her mother had done, and her mother's mother before her. This drink did not energize or excite. It warmed, restoring breath to the chest and the hands, especially after a long night spent wrestling with sleep. When a person had slept poorly, the entire house knew. Even the floorboards seemed to creak more softly. Even the birds outside delayed their songs. Sleep wasn't merely a personal condition, it was part of the home's fabric. In it were woven breaths, worries, expectations. And when someone in the house was sleepless, everyone felt it, even if nothing was said. In old times, people did not fight insomnia. They wove it into ritual, like a dark thread in a cloth. They didn't hide it nor feel shame. They would say, if the night withholds sleep, then it brings something else. Something that must be listened to, endured, accepted. In the neighboring house lived Agatha, an old woman, blind in one eye, but one who had seen much. People called her the night healer. Not because she only treated at night, but because she understood the language of night. People didn't come to her for medicine. They came for understanding. Gretel often recalled her words. Sleep isn't what comes to you. Sleep is what you walk toward. If the path is blocked by fears, if the day was crooked, if the heart is noisy, you won't make it. That's why you don't sleep. So during the day, to ease the night ahead, a different kind of work would begin. The preparation of inner space. It wasn't called that, and it was simply done. Tidying the house, taking out ash, washing tablecloths, sorting dried herbs. But all of it wasn't just for cleanliness. It was to stitch shut the daytime gaps through which worry might seep into the night. Gretel sat by the window and began to sort bunches of dried plants. In her hands were thyme, yarrow, St. John's wort, mint, chamomile. Each bundle, like a small piece of light, gathered at different times of year. The herbs rustled, crumbled, released their spicy scent, and with that scent, it was as if the air in the room was being mended, like torn fabric being patched. Sometimes, when insomnia returned again and again, people would go to the forest. Not to gather, not to hide, but to return the silence, as they said. The forest did not heal directly. It revealed scale. How small a person's worry was next to the wind, next to a centuries-old tree, next to an owl perched atop a pine. But today, Gretel did not go to the forest. She had enough peace inside. She knew that the night was like fabric. Into it, one could sow pain, sow fear, even sow sleeplessness. And if done with care and reverence, the fabric would not tear. A new pattern would appear, quiet, subtle, meant only for those who know how to look in the dark. The night that looks back. Evening approached quietly. The sun no longer shone. It glowed like an old ember fading in a hearth, casting its last reflections on the house's logs. The air was heavy, not with fear or pain, but with the weight of the day. The scent of heated walls, fresh bread, and linen drying near the stove hung in the space. Gretel knew that night didn't arrive all at once. It came in layers, like wool being wound around the shoulders. First the sky darkened, then the distance blurred, then the birds fell silent, and only then full darkness. When a person struggled with insomnia, it meant that the night had arrived, but had not accepted them. And in such moments, one must not rush, must not demand sleep, but simply watch, first outward, then inward. The elders used to say, if you look long into the night, it begins to look back. This was not a metaphor. It was a way of life, because to them, the night was a being, not a faceless dark, not a backdrop, but a present with vision, memory, and even mood. And with such a being, one had to act with respect, not argue, not panic, not scream into a pillow, but sit, still, calmly. Light a candle, and let the night know that you were there, not as a conqueror, but as a guest. Gretel had lived through nights like this before, more than once. There had been frightening ones, when her heart beat like a trapped bird, when thoughts flared like dry grass. Then she would whisper to her herbs, press her palm to her chest, and recall her grandmother's words. Sometimes insomnia lasted for days, and then people used transitions. Transitions were gentle actions that helped move consciousness from wakefulness into drowsiness. Not forcefully, but softly, like sorting beans in a bowl, listening to the rhythm until sounds began to blur, or reciting an old prayer without meaning until the words became a hush, or lighting the coals and gazing into the fire until the eyes slipped inward. Such transitions could not be rushed. They either began on their own or didn't. But the attempt was important because it showed the night. The person was trying. Gretel did not hurry to lie down. She knew. When the night resists, you don't press it with your body. You find a way around. You lay a path. With soft breath, with silence, with simple motions. She took an old wooden spoon, one never used for eating. It was her spoon of stillness. That's what they called objects that carried quiet within. Some people had smooth stones, others carved buttons, others fragments of clay pots. These things didn't cure, but they reminded a person the world was not falling apart. With the spoon in hand, logs in the stove, and a hint of lavender in the air, Gretel sat by the window. And she didn't wait for sleep. She let it find its own path. Outside, the dark deepened, but it wasn't empty. It was rich, almost velvet. In it lived owls. Foxes wandered. Trees breathed deeply. This was a night full of life, just unseen by the eye. And when, after a long time, Gretel felt her eyes grow heavy, she was not surprised. Sleep had arrived, not as a prisoner, but as a wise companion who had accepted her invitation. And in this hush, wrapped in herbs, coals, spoon, and breath, she slipped into the night. The sleep keepers. No one sees in old villages. People used to say, sleep is not only your concern, it has its keepers. These were not fairy tale creatures or spirits in the usual sense, but rather unseen states that a person could enter, or not. They couldn't be summoned, couldn't be forced. They came only to places prepared for them. Since childhood, Gretel had heard the elders say, "Don't go to bed with a noisy soul." A noisy soul wasn't just fear or worry. It was an unfinished thought, an unresolved day, an unspoken word. Anything that had not found its place would tug at you during the night, disrupt your rhythm, and keep your body from surrendering to oblivion. That's why in those times, sleep had its preparers. That's what they were called, those who prepare sleep. These could be actions, objects, scents, even certain sounds. Every family had its own, refined over generations. For Gretel, one of these preparers was an old woolen shawl. It had once belonged to her grandmother, who wore it when tending the house at the end of autumn. The shawl smelled of smoke, dried herbs, and something else faint, something that could only be described as peace. When Gretel wrapped herself in it, her body seemed to remember all the good that had been, and all that was bad lost its weight. She also used a clay bowl filled with sand, into which she'd place a small burning pine chip. The scent, barely there, not strong like resin or incense, reminded her of something very distant but intimate. Some said such aromas reconnected a person to the shadow of their childhood, returning them to the time when sleep was effortless. In ancient understanding, sleep didn't come to silence, but to harmony. That's why it was important for not just the body, but the whole house to slow down. The walls should not echo with others' voices. The hearth should breathe evenly. Even animals, cats, dogs, chickens, were expected to be asleep. Otherwise, they'd say, "The sleep keepers will not come. It's too loud." And then came the final step, letting go. This was the moment when a person accepted they had done everything they could. They did not demand sleep, did not cry out for it, did not fight. They simply gave themselves over to the night, like a river settling beneath the ice, calm, without resistance. Gretel, in such moments, would place her hands across her chest, in a cross-like shape, just as she'd been taught. One finger lightly touching her collarbone, another over her heart. This posture brought her a sense of inward stillness. She did not pray in the usual sense, but in her thoughts flowed a wordless gratitude. For the fire, for a roof overhead, for the chance simply to be. In folk wisdom, it was said, "Sleep loves a warm heart and an empty head." That didn't mean foolishness. It meant all thoughts should be laid out, like clothing before a journey. And when everything was in place, sleep would enter the house. Not as a doctor, not as a long-awaited savior, but as an old friend who simply sat at the foot of the bed and breathed with you in the same rhythm. Sleep as a path. Between worlds, in those times, sleep was not seen as a mere physiological need. It was a transition, a threshold, a kind of road that a person walked each time the night took them by the hand. And so, the approach to it wasn't utilitarian, but almost sacred. The elders used to say, "In sleep, a person steps out of time to return renewed." That's why insomnia was not just considered an ailment, but a sign. Not an accident, not a biological glitch, but a message. Something inside is blocking the crossing. Somewhere the path is overgrown. Somewhere the bridge has collapsed. Somewhere in the soul there is noise or pain that keeps one from entering a different state. To help themselves pass through this path, people created sleep rituals. These were not official, not religious, not magical. They were quiet domestic rites, containing no sorcery, only attentiveness, gentleness, and repetition. One such ritual involved brushing one's hair in silence, standing at the window, facing the darkness. It wasn't done for beauty, but for balance. People said, "When hair's tangled, so are your thoughts." Brushing smoothed the inner threads. Hair, in ancient times, wasn't just part of the body. It was a carrier of memory. It wasn't cut unnecessarily, never thrown to the wind. Touching it, especially before sleep, had deep meaning. It was as if the person were saying to themselves, "I remember. I'm here." I release another preparation involved water, not for washing, but to soothe the pulse. In a small clay bowl, cool water was kept, with a few drops of motherwort or lemon balm infusion. It wasn't drunk, only touched. Fingers were dipped into it and then brushed across the temples, the neck, the palms. This gesture, repeated 3 times, helped to turn off the excess. Gretel, following ancient teachings, always knew that sleep was not a bodily need, but a sign of the soul's readiness to go inward. And if the soul wasn't ready, one should not get angry. One should learn to accompany it. On one particularly difficult day, when she couldn't fall asleep, even after all her usual steps, herbs, spoon, shawl, stillness, she stepped outside. It was autumn, and the air smelled of wet wood and distant smoke. The sky was murky but vast. She didn't do anything special, just stood there, for a long time, looking into the darkness, breathing in the chill, feeling the earth under her feet. Gradually, her thoughts began to scatter, like autumn leaves, not vanish, but release their grip on her. And then she understood. Sleep does not enter a heart clenched by fear. It waits until you unfold, like a curtain in the wind, until there is room for it, not just space, but a true invitation. Such nights didn't always bring dreams. Sometimes they brought only a steady, deep nothingness. And that too was a gift, because the elders said, there is no greater healer than a night in which you disappear without fear. The Twilight Guardians and the First Threshold. Long ago, before clocks and dials existed, people marked the beginning of sleep by observing the behavior of twilight. They believed that between the light of day and the darkness of night, there was a special zone, a threshold, where the soul had not yet departed, but was no longer fully present. This zone was guarded by twilight keepers, not spirits or people, but states of being. They said, if you don't pass through twilight's threshold, the night won't accept you. It was the first subtle barrier, unseen to the eye, but deeply felt. One could miss it by lighting a candle too late or speaking too loudly. If ignored, the whole night would feel disoriented, as though the door was never fully shut, and a draft of unease drifted through the house. Gretel especially honored this twilight hour. It lasted only about 30 minutes, from the moment the sun slipped behind the forest to when the candle was finally lit indoors. During this time, there was to be no slamming of doors, no changing clothes, no sweeping the floor. Everything had to be gentle, fluid, as though the house itself were inhaling the night. She would sit by the window, often doing nothing at all. Just sit, listening to the quieting of the birds, the creaking of old wood in the corner, the cat settling into stillness. It was a time of slowing down, almost of dissolving. Those who disrespected this moment often suffered from insomnia, restless dreams, or woke up in cold sweat. It was said they had entered the night without permission. In some villages, there was a custom of leaving a small bowl of milk and honey by the window, not as an offering, but as a sign of trust, not for anyone in particular, just for the night itself. To say, we're not afraid of you, we welcome you, we are open. Back then, sleep didn't begin in bed. It began right here, in these first silent minutes between the days. People used to say, sleep comes to those who've already left the world of day, but haven't yet stepped into night, who stand in the doorway without tugging on the handle. Gretel remembered one night especially vividly. It was winter. The house still held warmth from the stove, but all around was darkness, thick as wax. She sat by the window and closed her eyes. She wasn't sleeping, just allowing herself to exist. And suddenly she felt time stop. No sound, no movement, not even a single anxious thought. Just a soft, transparent expectation of something already on its way. And that was sleep. It didn't crash down like a wave. It didn't grab her. It came quietly, like an old friend who needs no words. She didn't even remember lying down, only waking in the morning with her whole self smoothed out even, as if gently carved from the inside. And so, she understood. Sleep isn't something you catch. It's something that comes when you've let go of everything unnecessary. Silence as medicine. If silence could have been measured back then, it would have been valued no less than bread. People knew silence heals. Not just the ears, not just the nerves, but the very depth of the human self. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was a state of presence, where nothing prevented one from hearing themselves. Silence was the first thing offered to those suffering from insomnia. Not herbal sedatives, not advice, not prayers, just one instruction. Be silent first. Then you'll hear what's keeping you awake. In Gretel's house, there was a special room, small and dim, where no one spoke. Not because it was forbidden, but because something was different there. Even the walls, it seemed, didn't echo sounds. Elders called such spaces sleep nests. No things were stored there, no conversations held. People simply rested. Saturday stayed quiet. Gretel often entered that room in the evenings, not to sleep, but to pause. She would sit on the wooden bench, wrap herself in a shawl, lay her hands on her knees, and simply be, with no goal, no expectations, no struggle. Silence would begin its work on its own. At first it rang in her ears, then spread through her body as if dissolving her boundaries, like water washing away traces on the shore. Gretel's grandmother taught her, silence isn't when nothing exists. It's when everything exists, and you're in no rush to respond to it. Back then, people understood that insomnia wasn't a bodily ailment, but a kind of tension in the space itself. And silence was what discharged that tension, like rain clearing the air before a storm. That's why before sleep, people tried not to speak unnecessarily, not to argue, not to think too loudly. Even dishes were washed without clatter in the evening. No clinking of spoons, no slamming of doors. All sounds were softened, rounded. The house was filled not with dead silence, but with living stillness, like breathing, like the anticipation of a miracle. People used to say, when the house is quiet, the soul finds its way to sleep. Sometimes Gretel would place a smooth river stone under her pillow, a stone of silence, as they called it in the village. It was believed to absorb lingering conversations, unfinished thoughts, anything that kept the mind from resting. The stone would warm from the body and carry away what was blocking sleep. The most experienced healer said, sleep comes to those who are not afraid to be alone with silence. And it was true. For silence, like the night, could either open or wound. Those used to constantly filling themselves with words, noise, or tasks often felt anxiety in the quiet, like standing over a chasm. But those who could stop resisting saw not emptiness in silence, but vastness. And in that vastness, true, deep, clean sleep was born, like water that breaks through a rock once the rock ceases to resist. One night, when wind howled outside and thoughts circled like crows over a field, Gretel again went to that quiet room. She didn't even bring a candle. She sat down, hugged her shoulders, and slowly, very slowly began to let go of words, images, regrets, and worries. And suddenly she realized she had relearned how to simply be in silence. And that was the beginning of sleep. Warmth in the night. One of the oldest remedies for insomnia was warmth. Not heat, not fire, but a quiet, enveloping warmth that seemed to whisper to the body, "You are safe. All is well. You may let go." In those days, there were no heated blankets, no electric pads or warming sleep masks. But people knew the secret. Warmth is the body's memory of home. And to fall asleep, one had to remind the body that it was not on guard, not in motion, not in worry, but at rest. Gretel had an old pouch made of coarse fabric, sewn by her great-grandmother. It was filled with warmed stones and dried herbs, St. John's wort, thyme, yarrow. Before bed, she would place it at the foot of her bed. The stones held their warmth until morning, and the herbs released a fragrance as if the earth itself was breathing beside her. Warm hands were another form of medicine. In every household, someone was known as a warmer, not just with their palms, but with attention, presence, and inner stillness. Such hands didn't cure, didn't instruct, didn't disturb. They simply touched a shoulder, a back, or a forehead, and the anxiety would dissolve. Knots within the body would loosen and night would enter slowly, but inevitably. People believed that sleep was like wintering, and to fall asleep you needed to warm the den. And that warmth wasn't always physical. Sometimes it came from objects with memory. An old dress of a mother, a wooden bowl from which a grandfather had eaten, a woolen scarf that once wrapped a newborn. One especially cold autumn night, Gretel couldn't fall asleep. The stove had gone out, the wind howled, and the house felt as though it had no walls. She sat wrapped in blankets, but still her body trembled. Then she remembered her grandmother's words. Don't always look for warmth in the fire. Sometimes it lives in memory. So Gretel began to remember. The smell of milk by the hearth, the rustle of linen skirts, the weight of a cat curled at her feet, the way her grandmother stroked her hair before bed. And, miraculously, her body began to thaw. It believed all those things were here again. And soon, without realizing how, she fell asleep. Sometimes in the village they practiced a ritual known as night holding. It was more than just physical closeness. When someone couldn't sleep, whether a child, an elder, or a grieving woman, they would be laid beside another person. That person wouldn't speak or comfort them. They would simply breathe beside them, share the warmth of life. And in the night, wordlessly, it worked deeper than any potion. Sleep that followed such holding was unique, like returning to the womb, like shelter from the whole world, like a deep exhale after long-held fear. Gretel understood. Warmth is a language even an infant knows. It needs no translation. It does not argue. It does not force. It simply is. And in that language, the body finds the way to sleep, without effort, without fear, like coming home. The rhythms of body and earth. 500 years ago, people didn't wear sleep trackers on their wrists. They didn't know the word circadian, and they didn't chart deep or REM sleep in spreadsheets. But they felt, through experience, that sleep doesn't come by command, but by rhythm. And that rhythm cannot be imposed from outside. It can only be heard. Back then, people lived in harmony with nature, not by choice, but by necessity. They rose with the sun and lay down when it left. They ate when food was available, worked when there was light, and they slept, not when they had to, but when the moment ripened. Sleep wasn't a task. It was a part of the cycle, like the tide, like ripening grain, like the world's breath. That's why insomnia was seen as a disruption of the inner rhythm, not of the body alone, but of the whole human earth system. In the village where Gretel lived, there was a belief. If you can't sleep for 3 nights in a row, it means you've lost the rhythm of the earth. To restore it, you had to realign with nature. The first remedy, walking barefoot at dawn. The elders would take the sleepless out into the dew. It stung the souls, cleansed, sobered. Feet, they said, were the body's antennae. Through them, a person tuned back in to the frequencies of the field, forest, and sky. The second, watching the sky. Healers taught, watch the moon, see how it wanes, how it grows. Watch the clouds, learn to wait, like rain, without becoming angry. The third, tactile rhythm. People who couldn't sleep would weave, not for the product, but for the process. The repetition of motion, up, down, back, forth, thread by thread, restored an inner wave, like a boat rocking back into balance. Gretel would also weave, sometimes at night. She wasn't making cloth, she was returning to herself. With each motion of the thread, her breathing deepened. Her body relaxed, her thoughts stopped running. She wasn't waiting for sleep. She simply entered the motion, and sleep arrived on its own, at the right time. Certain days were dedicated to rituals of rhythm alignment. On those days, No one made noise, argued, or broke the house's stillness. No axes rang, no brooms clattered, no children ran. People moved slowly, ate simply, spoke little. They called it a day of tuning. It wasn't only for the sleepless, it was for everyone, because one person's rhythm affected all others. Gretel once told her friend, "I can feel your sleep breathing in me, and mine in you. We don't sleep alone as we think." And it was true. Calm wasn't a personal achievement. It spread like the smell of bread, like chimney smoke, like evening prayer. If no one in one house slept, something stirred in the next. But if one woman calmed down, others began to breathe more evenly too. The elders taught, don't treat insomnia separately. Restore the rhythm of life. That's the key. Because then, sleep didn't need to be hunted. It found you itself, like returning to a native wave, like water finds the shore, like a heart finds its own beat again. The shadows of sleep. Sleep in those times was not merely rest for the body. It was seen as a passage, a threshold, a narrow path between worlds. People believe that in sleep, the soul leaves the body and travels. Sometimes it walks familiar roads, remembering, processing, healing. But sometimes it wanders far, to places where it should not linger too long. That's why insomnia was not just a bodily problem. It was a sign that the soul was not ready to enter the night. People would say, he cannot sleep because his soul fears to go where the dreams are calling it. Such fear was not treated with herbs or teas, but by the elders, not healers or herbalists, but dream keepers. Every settlement had at least one, usually old women who had lived through much, death, birth, silence, war. They knew how to speak with shadows. As a young woman, Gretel often suffered from nightmares. Her body would fall asleep, but her soul, it seemed, would stumble and plunge into an abyss. She would wake up screaming, her hair soaked in sweat, filled with a shapeless terror. Her mother once took her to an old woman named Vida. Vida asked no questions about dreams. She simply looked into Gretel's eyes, then slowly, very slowly, placed her hands over Gretel's chest and said, "You don't fall asleep. You fall down." Sleep is not a collapse. It is an entrance. You must go in with reverence. From then on, Gretel learned to treat sleep like a ritual. She stopped speaking before bed. She didn't eat, didn't read, didn't think. She only washed her hands and face, laid her bed with intention, lit one candle, always just one, and sat until the flame became still. Only then would she lie down, and sleep would come differently. It didn't leap on her, didn't drag her into darkness. It opened itself, letting her in gently, tenderly. People back then believed that every dream casts a shadow. If a person refuses to face that shadow, it accumulates, grows heavy, bitter, and eventually begins to interfere with sleep altogether. These shadows had to be acknowledged, recognized, and released. This was done on special nights, full moons, season changes, when the veil between worlds was especially thin. Dream shadows were recorded, not in letters, but in symbols, patterns, and lines. People would draw what came in dreams onto bark, clay tablets, or cloth, not for beauty, for release. A shadow seen in daylight will not return at night, they said. As Gretel grew older, she began to notice that insomnia often came not when the body was exhausted, but when the soul avoided meeting something important. So instead of fighting sleep, she would step toward it. She would brew a bitter root, wear her woolen cloak, open the shutters, and gaze at the sky. And if fear remained, she would write or draw or sit silently with it. Then, sleep would come. Not as a defeated enemy, but as a friend who had waited for readiness. Herbs that don't knock you out, they tune you. In those distant times, no one said, drink and fall asleep. Healing drinks, infusions, decoctions, They weren't used to knock you out as we do with pills today. They didn't numb the mind, but instead calmed the inner current. The goal wasn't to force the body into sleep, but to bring a person into a state where sleep arrives naturally, without effort or struggle. Gretel knew many herbs, not from books, but by scent, by color, by how they behaved in the hand, how they sounded when rubbed between the fingers. Every plant had its own temperament, and not all were suited to every person. For instance, tansy, for those whose dreams became too sharp, like cutting edges. St. John's wort, for minds that spin like squirrels in a wheel. Valerian, for the anxious, but with care. Its strength is like a bear's, can help or crush. Lemon balm, for those who've lost their inner softness. Thyme, for men worn down by the outside world, who've forgotten how to breathe with their chests. Linden blossom, for mothers whose chests hold not sleep, but worry for their children. But the herb itself wasn't the most important thing. What mattered was the state in which it was gathered, dried, and brewed. A plant plucked in haste or anger lost its strength. It had to be picked with a bow, not of the body, but of the spirit. Gretel taught her nieces, you're not just taking from nature, you're entering into a pact, and a pact doesn't demand. It gives thanks. There were special evening gatherings. These happened at the end of summer, in the hush of twilight, when the day slipped away slowly, gently. Women would walk barefoot into the fields, with soft laughter and small bundles for collecting. They didn't speak much, only in whispers, with reverence. They didn't just look for herbs. They looked for what the earth itself would offer, like a melody waiting to be heard. After harvesting came the drying ritual. Not in heat, not in ovens, but on strings in the shade, where wind could sing but not scorch. The herbs hung like the silent ears of the earth, absorbing patience and strength. Then they were stored in pouches, not labeled by name, but by memory, by mood. When Gretel sensed the night would be heavy, she didn't just grab the nearest jar. She sat before the pouches, closed her eyes, and waited. Which scent would come forward on its own? Sometimes it was something bitter, sometimes smoky, sometimes sweet and earthy. It was the language of the body, the language of the soul, and it knew better than thought what was missing for peace. Brewing was also a ritual, not just pouring water, but waiting, steeping, breathing in 3 times, not gulping, but letting the tea sit in the mouth, understanding how it enters you, and only then, lying down. Not like someone exhausted and drained, but like someone ready, with the herb now inside, with breath already slowed. Then sleep would come, like a continuation of the tea, a continuation of the silence. Gretel once said, a herb isn't a sleeping pill, it's a messenger. If you don't hear it, no herb will help. But if you do, even a simple plantain leaf can become a doorway to deep sleep. The rituals of silence. In the dark times, when life was a weave of labor, loss, and waiting for the harvest, silence was not seen as emptiness. It was an instrument of healing, a way to balance the inner noise. And one of the oldest methods of treating insomnia was through rituals of silence. Gretel had been told that in some villages women and men would observe days of silence, not as a vow, but as a way of restoring the rhythm between body and soul. At dawn, one would rise without speaking a single word. They would drink water, rub their face with snow or dew, place a hand on their chest, and simply listen to how the day breathes. Silence didn't begin with the lips, but from within, because noise is rarely around us. It's in the mind, thoughts, worries, unfinished conversations, shadows of yesterday's grievances. They continue echoing inside, even when the outside is quiet. True silence was the clearing of space, between thoughts, between sensations, between actions. Usually, before such a ritual, People avoided meat. It was a transition into lightness, not just physically, but spiritually. They would eat roots, a bit of honey, drink infusions of oats and soft herbs, coltsfoot, linden, sage. The food wasn't meant to stimulate, only to nourish, like a low flame in the stove. On the day of silence, people avoided looking one another in the eye. This, too, was part of the ritual, because a gaze can be louder than speech. Instead, they looked at the ground, their hands, the sky, the smoke, places where silence lived freely. Sometimes, if someone needed help, a simple gesture was enough. A touch on the shoulder, a cup placed gently closer. And only at night, in this cleared-out quiet, would one lie down to sleep. Not just with the body, but with the whole being. Gretel used to say, "After silence, sleep doesn't come as a guest. It comes as the host. It knows you are ready." Rituals of silence were especially helpful for those tormented by inner voices, dialogues with the departed, reflections on injustice, the replaying of harsh words spoken in anger. These voices didn't go away on their own. They had to be released into silence, given space to echo and leave. There were signs for such rituals. A lit lamp in a certain window meant a person had asked not to be disturbed, or a wreath of dry herbs hung on the door. It was a language of consent to silence, and breaking it was seen as a spiritual clumsiness. Sometimes, after intense emotional turmoil, Gretel would go silent for 3 full days. During that time, she wouldn't just speak. She would not write, not read, not touch yarn or books. She simply walked, breathed, drank water, and watched. After a day, sleep would begin to return. Not yet deep, but slow, like something growing from the soil. And by the 3rd day, she would fall asleep like a child, without resistance, without remainder, with a feeling of fully belonging to the night. Silence was not a withdrawal from the world, but a return to oneself, to the place where true rhythm lives, and that rhythm was the key to sleep. Sleeves filled with salt. Sometimes, insomnia came not from worry, not from the chatter of thoughts, nor from physical pain, but from an invisible heaviness, as if something unspoken, unresolved, or withheld was lodged deep inside, preventing the body from fully letting go. On such nights, a person might be tired, yet still unable to sleep. Eyes closed, body still, but the mind stayed alert, like a watchtower that refused to lower its guard. The old healers recognized this kind of sleeplessness. They called it the salt within, because salt preserves, yes, but also dries, holds tension, draws the moisture out of life. Gretel used to say, sometimes to fall asleep, you don't need to add anything. You need to pull something out. Not calm the surface, but draw out what's stuck inside. For these cases, she had a special ritual, salt sleeves. These were long cloth tubes filled with coarse stone salt that had been gently warmed on a pan. But not just any salt, only the kind that had been dried under moonlight for 7 nights while surrounded by the smoke of selected herbs. The salt absorbed stillness, coolness, the memory of plants, and according to Gretel, it began to know how to hold peace. Before sleep, the person would undress down to their linen shirt and sit by the hearth. Gretel would wrap their wrists with these warm salt sleeves. Sometimes their calves, sometimes their shoulders. It depended on where the breath was blocked, where motion had ceased. The salt would start drawing out the invisible tension, not pain, not heat, but that deep anxiety, often unknown even to the person until they felt it leaving. At times, tears would come, not from sadness, but like rain after a long drought. That was the sign. The body had begun to release. Sleep did not come immediately, but it would arrive softly, gradually, like a shawl being draped over one's shoulders. If the insomnia was especially persistent, Gretel would place a pouch of salt beneath the pillow. She would say, "Salt doesn't put you to sleep. It carries the weight for you. It stands guard while you rest." There were also stronger rituals, for instance, salt writings. symbols traced lightly onto the palms or soles of the feet, using grains of salt and a slender stick. These were ancient signs, passed not through books, but through hands, symbols of earth, water, night. The person would lie still while the salt rested on their skin. The breath would slow, and eventually, sleep would come. If the salt darkened by morning, it was saved. It meant it had absorbed part of the pain. It would be taken to the forest or river and released back into the earth. Salt in those times was not only food, but memory. Not just a mineral, but a bridge between human and nature. It united dry and wet, heavy and light. And through it, the body remembered what it meant to simply be. To be tired, human, and ready to rest. Sleep in the shadow of trees, among forests where each tree was more than just a plant, where ancestral memory lived in the roots and prayers whispered through the leaves. There existed an old practice, to fall asleep beneath the tree bound to one's fate. In times when the body refused to embrace sleep, when every home remedy failed, wise women would lead a person into the forest. But not just any forest, to where their tree stood. The one that, as Gretel would say, has known them since birth. How was this tree found? It revealed itself. Sometimes, as soon as a person entered the grove, they would begin to yawn or feel their eyelids grow heavy. Sometimes, a coolness in the chest, as if the tree were already drawing out the excess. For some, it was an oak, strong and deep, like a drum, with a trunk full of steady power, capable of silencing even internal howling. For others, a birch, light and gentle, turning anxiety into a whisper barely heard. For some, a fir tree dark, with a resinous, shadowy scent, shielding them from the world like a cloak. Once the tree revealed itself, a woolen shawl was laid at its roots, and the person would lie down, head toward the trunk, face up. They were told never to sleep facing west. That was the direction of departure. One must sleep facing east or south so that sleep would come like life, not like forgetting. Gretel would burn herbs, juniper, thyme, wormwood. Sometimes she'd draw a circle in the soil. Sometimes she left a bowl of water nearby. But beyond that, she said nothing. Because in those nights, to speak was to interfere with the forest's work. Sleep came gradually, not suddenly, but as a rustle. First, the heaviness vanished, as if the earth inside the body was being replaced with air. Then, hearing dissolved, not into deafness, but into stillness, like a snail retreating into its shell. Then, time disappeared. The person would fall asleep, not for 1 hour or two, but sometimes an entire day and night. And upon waking, they were different. Not merely rested, but regrown into themselves, like a tree pushing deeper into its roots. Gretel said the forest healed not with herbs, but with space. There was a depth there that could not be found in homes or towns. The forest did not persuade, did not explain, did not insist. It simply was, and in its presence, everything else fell quiet. Sometimes when her own insomnia was unbearable, Gretel went to the woods alone. She took no food, only water. She sat beneath a fir or an aspen and simply breathed. And after a few hours, everything shifted, as if something deep beneath the earth had said, "Now, you may sleep." Dreams that bring water. There were certain types of insomnia, not from worry, not from pain, not from sorrow, but from dried-out dreams. When a person did sleep but saw nothing. Sleep came, yes, but it was empty, without depth, without color. It passed like a shadow and left nothing behind. And in the morning there was fatigue, a heavy, hopeless kind, as if the night had been spent not resting, but wandering through a lifeless void. This condition was called dry sleep, and it was considered dangerous, because sleep was not just rest, it was a river through which the soul moved. If the water in the river dried up, the soul couldn't go anywhere. If there were no dreams, the soul remained stuck, and everything inside the person began to stagnate. For this, Gretel had one of her rarest rituals, calling the water dream. It wasn't a medicine, a compress, or a brew, but a connection to an ancient current. The ritual began with water, But not just any water, what she called living water. It might come from a spring that burst through clay or melted snow gathered on the first day of spring sunshine. Sometimes rainwater, but only from a warm downpour, never from a storm. The water was placed at the head of the bed. Into it were added blue cornflower petals, a bit of grated valerian root, and a silver coin, a symbol of the moon and reflection. The water had to absorb it all. Color, scent, depth. Over it, Gretel whispered words she never allowed anyone to repeat. Words she said came to her in childhood. It was, she claimed, the language of dreams, not meant for waking ears. Then, the person would lie down. At their feet, a cloth dampened with the same water. On their forehead, a round pebble taken from a river. Everything had to be tied to moving water, because only water knows how to absorb without breaking, and how to carry without losing. The first night was restless. Often the person would feel as if someone was calling to them from far away. There might be images, shadows, forests, faces never seen before. These weren't dreams yet. They were the dream approaching. On the second or third night, the water dream would begin to flow. It was strange. Everything in it drifted. People, houses, even thoughts were fluid. Colors were deep, like in a well. These dreams rarely had words, but they had motion, as if someone was leading you through rivers, through waves, through underwater caves. After such dreams, a person would wake with wetness in their eyes, with a body that felt lighter, with breath that seemed just born. They often couldn't describe what they saw, but they had been somewhere, and that somewhere had healed them without language. Gretel used to say, "Sleep is the soul's water. Without it, the soul cracks. With it, everything inside begins to bloom." That's why she guarded water, not just as a liquid, but as a thread leading inward. And those who managed to follow that thread came back fully alive. The chains of the mind. Sometimes, insomnia didn't come from the body or the soul, but from the mind. It was subtle, almost shapeless, but gripping, like invisible shackles, wrapping around the head and refusing to let go. A person could be healthy, free from grief, even physically tired, yet still unable to sleep. Thoughts, like white mice, would run in circles, gnaw, return, build nests in the brain. The night became an echoing cave, where every inner sound came back twice as loud. This kind of sleeplessness Gretel called the clever cage. Not because the person was clever, but because the mind had become a trap, and to escape it with herbs or by sleeping under a tree was nearly impossible. Here, one had to free the mind itself. For this, there was an ancient practice, the weaving of thought paths. It wasn't magic, but something old, demanding patience and precision. It began with threads, different kinds: wool, flax, hemp, dyed and undyed. Gretel used to say, "Thoughts are threads. If you don't hold them, they tangle. If you weave them, they become a path." The person was given 5 skeins of thread, each a different color. Each color symbolized a type of thought: red, anger; blue, fear; yellow, desire; green, regret; black, thoughts without names, the ones hiding in corners. Throughout the day, whenever a thought arose, the person had to take the corresponding thread and weave it into a pattern, not randomly, but with careful order. One thought, one knot, one emotion, one twist. Sometimes the result was just a few centimeters. Other times, an entire belt length. By evening, the woven piece was brought to Gretel. She didn't inspect it with her eyes, but with her fingers, slowly, attentively, like a blind woman reading the fabric of the world. If a knot was tight, she'd untangle it. If the strands were torn, she would soak them in water. Night after night, the person would learn to see their thoughts as shape, not as storm. After 3 or 4 days, the mind grew tired of tangling. Thoughts, used to running wild, began to align. Like sheep growing used to a pen. Sleep came slowly, first in drowsy flickers, then like rain, soft but real. Gretel didn't cure thoughts, she taught them to live outside the head. She would say, while thoughts run inside, they fight. Let them out, and they build bridges. And the person who passed through this thought-weaving ritual no longer feared night. They knew everything that stirs in the mind has form, and that form can be laid down to sleep. The final sleep. When someone old passed away in the village, someone who had lived through many winters and seen much of life, their death was not called an end. It was called the Great Falling Asleep. For people believed if a person knew how to sleep well, they also knew how to leave well. And the opposite was also true. Those who fought with night all their lives, who never knew rest, often left this world in anxiety, with eyes open, having never accepted sleep even in their final moment. Gretel understood. Insomnia was not just an illness, but a mirror of one's life. Those who fell asleep easily lived in harmony. Those who fought for every night carried something inside them that even time could not loosen. She had one last ritual, which she used rarely, the sleep of farewell. It was meant for those who felt the night might be their last, not because of illness, but because their time had come. This ritual lasted the entire day and began with silence. The person was not to speak, not even in whispers. They were to be silent like the earth in winter. Only then, Gretel said, could the inner voice begin to speak, not in words, but in the breath of memory. Then the person walked through 7 places. In the morning, to the river. They washed with cold water to let go of the external. Later, to the field. There, they placed their hands on the soil to surrender their fears. At the forest's edge, they stood in silence before a tree to acknowledge their mistakes. Near their home, they looked at the window where the light once burned to remember love. At the well, they dropped in a small stone as a symbol of loss. In the garden, they inhaled the scent of herbs to accept joy. And finally, at their bedside, they sat, closed their eyes, and thought of nothing at all. In the evening, Gretel came, placed her hands on their chest, and whispered, "You have walked the day like a road. Now go into the night as into a garden. All that was blooms within you. All that will be is nothing to fear." And the person would fall asleep, sometimes forever. But they passed in peace, as though they weren't dying, but simply crossing to the other side of sleep, where there was no worry, no pain, no restlessness, only quiet, warm like a summer field, and clear like water over sand. That is how Gretel treated insomnia, not as a disease, but as a story, one that had to be lived all the way through, and everyone who passed through her care left with one certainty: night is not the end. It is the beginning of another path.